Hi there, my name is Emma Slayton,
And I'm Leilani Vasquez.
and today we're going to be talking about pretrial usage of electronic monitoring devices. So first off, right off the bat, what is electronic monitoring? Electronic monitoring is a form of digital incarceration, often in the form of a wrist bracelet or ankle shackle that can monitor a subject's location and sometimes also their blood alcohol level or breath. Monitors are commonly used as a condition of pretrial release or post-conviction supervision, like probation or parole. They're sometimes used as a mechanism for reducing jail and prison populations. Electronic monitoring has also been used to track juveniles, immigrants awaiting legal proceedings, adults in drug rehabilitation programs, and individuals accused or convicted of DUIs or domestic violence. While we're going over our presentation, the scope of our focus is going to be on those subjected to electronic monitoring devices while awaiting trial, so pretrial usage of it. Electronic monitoring has seen a 140% increase in just over a decade. About 125,000 devices are currently in use, with up to 30,000 of them attached to immigrants on any given day. States with the most prolific use of electronic monitoring include Florida, Texas, California, Massachusetts, and Michigan. Not only does electronic monitoring pose excessive surveillance of people coming home from prison, but it also hinders their ability to successfully transition back into their community, as you will see.
All right, so now we can get into some of the pros and why some people like electronic monitoring. One of the first points that I have is entirely really dependent on the perspective of the reviewer, but it is that it is less costly for the state. On one hand, a complaint of incarceration is that taxpayers support the resources that go into the costliness of keeping inmates. So if pretrial defendants pay for their own electronic monitoring systems, the state avoids conflicts with budgets and the taxpayers that provide money to keep the system running. According to the research shown in our presentation, the potential to save thousands of dollars will add up to saving thousands of dollars on each person who serves under electronic monitoring. And even at the pretrial level, incarceration is still very costly to uphold, and the state can focus more resources on other social programs if the alternative method is utilized. And my second point is that it is seen as a better alternative to awaiting trial in jail or prison. For the purpose of pretrial detention, conditions of electronic monitoring are slightly better to an individual because of the avoidance of violence and the freedom to just move, work, and be in a homely space. Incarceration as an environment can have negative impacts on mental health to the individual. Individuals who serve via electronic monitoring are allowed more freedoms than a defendant would receive while awaiting trial in jail or prison. In most cases, individuals are not required to be home 100% of the time while being monitored. If the goal of incarceration is deterrence, electronic monitoring allows people to contribute to society positively by being active in the workforce. Additionally, work allowance takes some of the financial burden of incarceration off of families, and at the very least, individuals who have not potentially committed violent crimes should not need to be subjected to the experience of incarceration. And one of my last points is, or one of my other points is that it reduces prison overcrowding. Why unnecessarily overcrowd the system to incarcerate an individual who may or may not be guilty of a crime and still awaiting a trial? Individuals who are locked up lack the quality of due process that is supposed to happen before being let up to the ultimatum of incarceration. And now my last point is that electronic monitoring has been found to reduce recidivism, or the rate at which offenders are likely to reoffend, as we can see in the study that has been cited in our presentation.
So while initially someone might think that electronic monitoring is way better than simply waiting in a jail cell, there are actually a lot of issues with it. So first, right off the bat, a lot of these costs, while the state is saving money by not having to pay it themselves in most cases, those costs are put onto the person who's subjected to electronic monitoring devices. For instance, here in Fairfax County, we actually have some really nasty high fees. According to a study from 2021 done by George Washington University, here in Fairfax County, someone awaiting trial that's subjected to an electronic monitoring device might pay up to $20 a day in fees and an estimated $4,405 annually on average, which is insane. You also, it's a lot of people that are having to deal with these fees, they're often going to debt. Sometimes they might not be able to pay like their mortgage, or they may not be able to pay their rent. It can go becomes a whole problem. Why are we subjecting people to these fees when the state was previously paying like, these sorts of fees at a higher level when they're just simply waiting in a jail cell? Why is the state not covering this in many cases? It's pretty insane and a major problem behind it, actually. There's also a lot of social consequences. A lot of people that have to wear these devices. For instance, a study that was just done by Harvard only a few months back in September 2022 concluded that electronic monitoring devices made it more difficult for defendants to secure, keep a job, and maintain vital social connections because of the stigma of appearing convicted of a crime, even though the individual is still awaiting a trial. I remember reading a story about how there was a parent, who was like, worried that their kid might like, get shamed by like, their friends' parents or something, or worried that they wouldn't allow them to hang out with their child anymore simply because they're being switched to an ankle monitor device. So not only are the social consequences like affecting the individual subjected to it, but also to their families as well. There's also a negative impact it can have on one's health. For instance, many of these people that are subject to these devices, you can't really get an MRI or mammogram, an X-ray, CT scan, etc., while you're subjected to one of these devices. And it can be kind of a massive hurdle to like jump through all the hoops needed to get approval for that kind of thing. And God forbid you need to go to the ER. That's a whole, nasty set of problems right there. And also for those who are pregnant, especially given the unpredictability of childbirth, you can have cases where you'll run into problems simply because you have to go deliver at a hospital suddenly, like maybe at a non expected date. I think there's a lot of concern, especially going on right now in cases in states, the recent repeal of Roe v. Wade, about what's going to happen in these states with less reproductive rights. Another massive issue regarding electronic monitoring devices is that minorities and lower income individuals are more likely to be subjected to it than those of higher incomes or those that are not a person of color. So we actually found a lot of stuff. So this great source, Media Justice, who did a lot of work regarding electronic monitoring devices. They, for instance, studied Cook County, where Black people only represent 25% of the population, yet they constituted 70% of the jail population, a similar percentage of those on pretrial electronic monitoring. Just like much of the criminal justice system, this is a problem that's prevalent everywhere. And you see this again with electronic monitoring devices as well. And one big issue is like risk assessment tools. So essentially, when you're talking about pretrial defendants, about who gets subjected to these devices versus who's simply let out on bail or who's simply let out, on, their word that they're going to come back and be there for the trial at hand, it has to do with like whether or not, like, what's their risk assessment? How likely is it they're going to show up to court? And some of these tools, they're biased against people, like they're more likely to impact people of color and those of lower incomes than they are, those that are white or wealthier individuals. It's also likely that those that can afford better lawyers, more better, not, they're not just simply relying on a public defender for the trial, are more likely to go ahead and they know how to go through the hoops versus a public defender who might, be a bit overwhelmed with various cases. There are other issues like such as, even as early as 1992, when these devices were trying to get more use across the country, this is being questioned, is this actually constitutional? Because we're talking about whether or not, like, the whole concept of like innocent until proven guilty is kind of like put to the wayside with the whole idea of subjecting somebody waiting trial with a electronic monitoring device in many cases, because you're basically treating them as if they're, already guilty of a crime. And especially because like these devices, they aren't really alternatives to incarceration. They're more of like an alternative form of incarceration, as you'll see more and more later on. And another big issue with these devices is that they probably require more, they probably require that the state perform more than, is actually necessary in many cases. A lot of these people for many years, for most of the history of this country, people were let out pre-trial without these sorts of devices and still showed up to court. And there are some studies that suggest that, like, they're just as likely to show up to court, or like, there's minimal difference in their likelihood of showing up to court with or without these devices. So it's, are we really going through all the hoops? Are we subjecting people to all this harm for like a significant reason? Questionable.
Okay, so now we're moving on to our final position, and it begs the question of, is pretrial usage of EM justified, ethical, and or effective? And we say no. Electronic monitoring isn't an alternative to incarceration. It is simply an alternative form of incarceration. Electronic monitoring isn't justified because the system for electronic monitoring itself is inefficient because of how unregulated it is. Many people serving under EM struggle with miscommunications with the person supervising them. In an example from a Vice article written by Aaron Cantu, he explains, but those who have to wear the devices complain of malfunctions, poor communication from county officials, and conditions that amount to imprisonment, even though many of them, like Malia, who is someone who was in the study, have not been convicted of a crime. EMs experience technical difficulties that make it very inconvenient for the defendant being forced to wear it. And why utilize EMs and have people pay for it if they don't even serve their main purpose in the first place? Next, EMs propose disproportionate fees and financial constraints for those who are impoverished and socially marginalized. In a case where the defendant is still waiting to be heard, the financial burden is entirely unnecessary and unequal to those of different socioeconomic statuses. And lastly, the system is not ethically balanced for the families. In a case where they're living with a pretrial defendant, families and friends are forced to cooperate with law enforcement, meaning they have to be on call at all times, give up their contact information, and basically kind of go through the same punishment as the person who is being electronically incarcerated. Often the costs of EM are forced onto the defendant, and in many cases becoming a source of debt. There's also a sense of public humiliation while at permitted locations such as work or the grocery store. EMs can make it hard for people to even find a job because of the harsh stigmas associated with the optics of having an ankle monitor on in public.
It's clear that like much of our present day criminal justice system, electronic monitoring programs need to be seriously overhauled. As things currently stand, many of these programs are causing unnecessary harm, are unequally applied to minority and lower income populations, often have predatory private corporations making a profit by forcing fees on those subjected to electronic monitoring, and in many cases require more involvement from the state than what is probably even warranted.
And now we have our references. Thank you so much, and just keep going with that. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.